Hello there. This is a design breakdown of a level blockout that I did. Since I want to keep it relatively short, I won't deep dive into every little thing in regards to the process and such. So, after a brief introduction, I'll focus primarily on the micro and macro design to help you understand why I designed the level the way that I did. So, what's the level about? The level is made for a conceptual first-person shooter, which features ranged combat, cover, light platforming and such. The player's objective is to reach a ruined temple dedicated to the sun, acquire a power-up and then head towards the extraction point. Along the way, they will have to do some platforming and fight beasts and solar-type enemies. Since this is intended to be the first level of the conceptual game, I wanted to keep the difficulty relatively low. Some restrictions I had was that the playtime should roughly be 15 minutes or so. Once you reach the objective, the way back should feel and play differently, and the power-up you get at the objective should have a straightforward usage. Alright, so let's jump into the level. So, as we start and head down towards the log in the middle, we can see the temple, a glimpse of it in the distance. I wanted the player objective to be a consistent focal point throughout the level. This is because I wanted to guide the player and to give them a sense of progression as they move throughout the level. To maintain this during the design process, I placed big cubes where the temple would be as I shaped the perspectives of the level. So this is during the very early, first pass of the level. I then show certain points where it would be visible from. Like so. I didn't want it to be visible from everywhere, because by hiding it, you give greater impact to each reveal. I start off by teasing it a bit, and then I hide it with the slope, only to tease it once again, once they jump on top of the rocks. And the big reveal happens after they pass through this narrow tunnel, as you'll see shortly. This helps build anticipation for the player when you see these small teases, which is nice. When I design, I like to use contrast and variation because it helps keep things visually and spatially interesting. One such thing I used throughout the level was funneling. This is by controlling the size of the play space or view to, for example, help make spaces feel bigger or smaller than they actually are. So when you go from a very tight space into a big room or outdoors, it can both give a sense of relief from the claustrophobia and to directly contrast what you just experienced. We can, for example, see this in the beginning here, where the player walks along a narrow forest path, then an even tighter small cave that exits out into this huge open space and vista with the temple as the focal point. Then we can also see further narrow and broader funneling throughout the level. So then we'll head down into the tunnel, crouch down, and we'll exit out into the big reveal I mentioned. Wow. So off to the side and leading up to this and throughout the level I also use soft fencing. This is when you basically form visual walls or blockers to help guide the player's movement and vision. This can be seen in many games, especially open world ones, since they can't always physically block players in their huge worlds. This could be grass, bushes, rocks, cars, and so on. So, for example, there could be something over here, or in the distance that you didn't want the players to focus on or see quite yet. You can block it with soft fencing. So, and as we can see from this shot from Immortals Phoenix Rising, there's nothing actually physically blocking me from moving between these bushes and such off to the side here. But it makes the surrounding less interesting and creates a sort of visual blocker and help focus our attention on the focal point that is silhouetted in the distance. But since it's so far away, they also have a closer focal point to help draw players in as well over here. So as we head up towards the full reveal of the temple, we can also see to the side a closer focal point to draw players in towards a better vista view. And here players can be rewarded with a nice vista, as well as a proper look at their objective in the distance to the temple, as well as some visual breadcrumbing with pillars and such. So they were led to what was perceived to be a dead end from visual interest and soft fencing, but it is in fact a bait and switch, with the path forward being revealed to them as they turn around, which also shows them one of the temple pillars as a breadcrumb. So since I didn't want to throw new enemies the player has never seen before, I wanted to tease them, to showcase that they exist, some of their capabilities, as well as create tension. So I hinted at an enemy reveal here. As we move through, here we can once again see the funneling going on, with going from a large space to a smaller and more enclosed space, leading to an open one in a bit. The curved path and soft fencing also nudges player into the center of the path. The player then sees another pillar, soft fencing pushing them towards the right, and rock path on the right, creating some visual contrast. To help communicate that this is the path forward, potentially some visual language like scratches might be needed, but I also have one of those pillars here, which the player can only see half of, so they could assume that it continues on the other side. This is also where the second beast enemy tease happens. Here, as we can see, except even closer this time. The enemy also helps show the path forward to the player. To help with the reveal of the next area, I wanted a soft turn leading into it. To help with this, I used an angled path, vegetation, and rock covering on the right, as you see the ceiling here, to help player movement flow more smoothly. If I removed this rock ceiling here, then it wouldn't be as immediately apparent that the path continued on the left. As the player enters the new space, they can both see more breadcrumb pillars, here and here, and a path leading to a better vantage point on the left with the rocks. As they move deeper in, they can eventually see the enemies. Since I wanted to draw players into the space a bit, I kept the enemies initially out of sight, but to allow the player to not get jumped from out of nowhere, they're faced away from the player, allowing them to see the enemies first and then plan their approach. So for the first combat space, I wanted something easy with good flow and options for the player. The enemies are melee beasts with above average move speed and jumping capabilities, giving the player ranged advantage. The area flows and loops around itself with multiple paths with no real dead ends. So we can see, for example, the player could move like this, jump here, and just keep moving in a fluid manner. At different points, the player should be able to see multiple options and paths to take. So let's see, for example, here they could, for example, take the left path, take the center path with the ramp there, or go to the right here to take the ramp up here, or just continue onwards. To save some time, I'll just fly over these guys. Start from here. So here the player needs to do some light platforming and also learn that they can destroy cracked surfaces by shooting them. Since the player can't progress unless they destroy the cracked pillar, we know the player understands how these surfaces work for the rest of the level. In addition, I wanted the level itself to make contextual sense, so I always kept in mind the kind of path the people of the temple would use to get there, where they would get their water from, and so on. These people lived here after all. So we'll just jump up here, like so. And this cave serves as a calmer moment where the player could soak in a nice looking cave, narrative moment, or the like. This is also here to give break from the prior and upcoming combat beat. So, as the player exits the cave, they get the full reveal of the temple from the front. Here the player can see the temple grounds, big temple doors, and on the right, silhouetted against the horizon, is the focal point. That's the path forward. So let's get a better view here. So when the player drops down, they're subjected to a so-called valve here, which disallows the player from going back the same way they came. As they proceed deeper into the space, they would engage in slightly more challenging beast encounter in a slightly more complex space, and partially of the increased difficulty will come from the beasts being more occluded in more kind of like tighter quarters to fight them in. So, even though the path forward has visual clues to guide them towards it, it's pretty natural. I just debug flying over these beasts. It's pretty natural that players might first want to examine the big locked doors over here. But when they notice that the doors are locked, they can notice the focal point from the position of the door. I wanted it to both be visually appealing and close to the doors, so that this would be their potentially next destination. To help guide players' attention, I have flags that would blow in the wind here. But they could potentially also be longer pennants to make them more visually distinct, since motion is a good eye catcher. Here I have things like visual language, some rubble and such to help clue players in that this is the path that they should take. I also have might be a little bit hard to see now, but I also have a visual yellow glow from the crack, which would most likely be increased if the level received an art pass to further pique the player's interest and draw them in. This is also a platforming similar to what the player has done before, except they could die from falling, so the intensity is increased a bit here. So I'll just quickly jump across here. So, and here we also have another valve when the pillar crumbles and falls behind the player. This is partially to disallow the player to backtrack this way after they pick up the objective, since we wanted to play through the level after all. And at the hole in the wall, the player would first see a yellow light glowing, and as they move in, they would catch a glimpse of something glowing brightly in the distance here. But they would have to move around the pillar to see it in full view. The idea was that this is a temple to the sun, and the people here used orbs infused with the sun's power to manipulate objects around them. And as we grab this sucker, the player also learns how to manipulate these glowing solar objects, like so. And the player can also catch glimpses of the other side through cracks and such in the walls and through doors. Once again, the player can progress until they properly use the soul power in this safe area, so we know they understand the concept if they progress. Here, the platforming intensity is increased a bit more and combines the cracked surface and solar objects again. The thrown focal point helps guide players to where they need to go as well. So we'll quickly jump across here. So, as the player exits, they can look around and see a pillar that they can jump to, which could potentially give them a better view of where to go next. This also helps give them a nice vista view and helps break up from the interior space they were just in. This area also has another bait and switch, which they could either loop around the pillar's edge, or just look around like so, or follow the flying bats to see where they should go next. While this solar cover object won't block the player, since it's right in their path, they will most likely use their power to see how it behaves, which will help them in the upcoming combat sections. As I've done throughout the level, I let the players also see where they've been, to both help with orientation and their sense of progression. Hey, I've been there moment. This is also where the player would get some kind of like clues or hints that enemies are close by. For example, by hearing sounds of an explosion in the distance, some banter the player can listen in on, etc. So as we head in here, we'll see the first combat section. To get a better view, we'll switch over to GIMP. So since this is the first combat versus this new soldier enemy type, where they can use solar power objects in combat, I wanted to keep it easy and simple. Enemies are faced away from the player, so they have time to take in their surroundings and enemies. The intended enemy behavior would be for them to dig in, so the player would either have to try and pick them off from a distance or move along the flank here and use the solar cover objects to take out the enemies. They could also use this solar elevator, let's call it, to head over to higher ground and attack them from a higher vantage point. They can also see the goal in the distance here, right when they enter from here, which helps communicate, that's where I need to go. And I also can see here like the combat spaces are usually broken up with fronts. So this would be the enemy front, and this would be the player front, so like the player side, enemy side, with the kind of like more exposed neutral zone or no man's land. So it's kind of a familiar-ish space for the player as well. So we can do some sample gameplay here. So the player could, for example, go for the pillars here, erase this solar object here to get additional cover as they move through to try and flank enemies, or they can use it to go up to the second level to the elevated position. So we can just attack these guys here and go up here. And to depower this area up here, I also used brittle cover to protect the player from the enemy, but to also not make it too powerful. And as they move down here, they can make their way across like so and raise the cover pieces, take out the enemy and move forward. As the player approaches this hole here, they can both see light and the ropes leading down the hole. At the bottom there's also a pool of water to help communicate that it's safe to drop down. The open door leading to the exit is also in full view from here. So, as the player exits the temple, they can spot enemies from the steps, but they don't have any real cover up here. If they went to the left, towards the gondola, they would also be very exposed. So the right looks very appealing with the huge rock cover and crumbled parts of the steps leading down towards it. Even though this is a combat space the player has been in before, I wanted it to feel and play distinctly different. So the player enters from the opposing side, another enemy type, and now the active solar objects. Partially why I felt it was good to reuse this space is because it's the largest and most complicated combat space in the level. So since the player will have gotten familiar with it a bit before, it will be easier for them to move around with confidence in this space. To further help with this, I also split it up into two parts. The first wave's fronts are here, so the enemy side and the player side here. And the first part is only fought mainly in the area here. So as the player defeats the first wave and heads a little deeper into the combat space, the second wave of enemies will arrive from the cave entrance over here, causing the combat space to expand fully. Now naturally, when the enemies appear, they should announce their presence to the player, so it doesn't feel like they're appearing out of thin air. So they would probably like shout, "Hey, there they are," or something along those lines. And usually it's a good idea to have maybe 2 or 3 spawn points for enemies. But since the player has no air effect gear like grenades, and I wanted to keep it simple, since this would be the first level of this theoretical game, I chose to only have one so as not to overwhelm them as they're learning the game. So if we take a look at the space in more detail, we can see some potential paths the player can take. After defeating the first wave, these guys, the player could advance towards the central structure from here to here to push into the no man's land. To help them, they can use the solar objects. So, for example, these ones. To help them block lines of sight, create cover, or to use them as elevators to move on top of the central building. Or they could also push up along the right side here to flank the enemy arriving from the cave here, like so. As with the rest of the level, I wanted this space to have a good flow to it, so I wanted multiple options to be available from the different pieces of cover to allow players to weave their way through the level. So here are some example paths the player could have taken to when they move around, like for example they could have gone like so or something. So we can just do some sample gameplay, like the enemies would aggro when the player got over here and stuff, and I'll just debug kill them to make it go a little bit faster. So the player could just raise the cover when these enemies approach and attack the player. Once they've gotten a bit deeper in, then the player could have like moved like so and attack the enemies. They could have also just, for example, done like so and attack the enemies like so. Yeah, you get the idea. Once the player has defeated enemies, they will be able to use the gondola over here. Depending on the experience, a staggered activation might be good, so it basically charges up. So instead of having to defeat all enemies, it becomes ready to use a while into the combat. So if it drags a bit, the player can make their daring escape with the gondola. This gondola section could also be a good narrative moment or other neat thing to happen. So it could have been slowed down or extended further as the need requires. Once across, the player can make the way towards the extraction point and exit the level. And that's pretty much it for the breakdown. Feel free to let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.